Lee Nam-Yong's policy commentary, long, Seoul's Jongno district must guarantee the mobility rights and safety of the elderly through barrier-free policies. A new policy paradigm for urban mobility in a super-aged society is required. South Korea has already entered a super-aged society, according to Statistics Korea. As of 2025, the proportion of people aged 65 and older in South Korea is about 20.6%, while the proportion in Seoul is about 21%. However, Jongno district in Seoul shows a higher aging structure than the Seoul average, with the elderly population estimated at around 23%. Jongno district has a residential population of approximately 150,000, and more than 35,000 of them are estimated to be aged 65 or older. This means that more than 1 out of 5 residents in Jongno district is elderly. Such demographic change is a policy signal that the core standard of urban policy must shift from car-centered cities to people-centered cities. Looking at global standards in urban policy, mobility is already recognized as a fundamental right. The World Health Organization identifies pedestrian environments and public transportation accessibility as key policy indicators in its age-friendly city framework. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development also defines pedestrian accessibility and mobility convenience as essential infrastructure indicators for urban competitiveness. These policy trends show that mobility rights are not merely a welfare issue but a key element of urban competitiveness. I diagnose the mobility problem of Jongno district not as a welfare issue but as a structural issue of urban design. Urban mobility is a core urban infrastructure directly linked to economic activity, medical access, social participation, and tourism. In particular, in a super-aged society, if mobility is not guaranteed, social isolation and increased welfare costs occur simultaneously. Therefore, a barrier-free policy in Jongno district is not optional, but an essential urban strategy. A stakeholder analysis based on relational theory is necessary. I analyze urban policy through a relational framework. There are several stakeholders in the mobility policy of Jongno district. First are the elderly residents of Jongno district. Second are local merchants and workers in the tourism industry. Third are tourists and visitors. Fourth are administrative institutions such as the Seoul Metropolitan Government and the Jongno district government. Within the relationships among these stakeholders, mobility is not simply a transportation issue, but a key variable that simultaneously determines the structure of the regional economy and social welfare. Jongno district is the region with the most concentrated historical and cultural assets in South Korea. Global tourist attractions such as Gyeongbokgung Palace, Bukchon, Insadong, Gwanghwamun, and Seocheon are located here. According to data from the Seoul Institute, the number of visitors to Jongno district is estimated to exceed 20 million annually. However, the average tourist stay is only about 2 hours, which is relatively short. When the pedestrian environment is improved, both the length of stay and consumption increase simultaneously. Therefore, mobility policy is not merely a pedestrian environment improvement policy, but an urban economic policy. When the mobility rights of the elderly are guaranteed, local commercial districts are revitalized and tourism consumption increases. I argue that this issue must be analyzed within the relational structure of urban policy. When policy design considers the relationships among stakeholders, policy effectiveness is maximized. A structural diagnosis of the mobility environment in Jongno district is required. Jongno district is an area with significant structural constraints on the pedestrian environment within Seoul. The district is simultaneously subject to various urban regulations such as cultural heritage protection zones, landscape districts, and height restrictions. As a result, urban infrastructure improvement has become relatively difficult compared to other districts. In particular, the northern part of Jongno district combines steep terrain with aging pedestrian facilities, making the mobility environment particularly vulnerable. The total number of registered vehicles in Seoul is about 3.17 million, equivalent to roughly 330 vehicles per 1,000 residents. However, Jongno district has a higher proportion of pedestrian mobility than vehicle mobility. The problem is that pedestrian infrastructure is not designed based on elderly mobility standards. Sidewalk level differences, insufficient ramps, lack of elevators, and insufficient pedestrian signal times are major factors restricting the mobility of the elderly. The average walking speed of elderly people is approximately 0.8 meters per second, about 30% slower than that of younger adults. However, most pedestrian signal systems in Seoul are designed based on a walking speed of 1.2 meters per second. This means that it is structurally difficult for elderly people to cross intersections safely. Therefore, the mobility issue in Jongno district is not merely a welfare issue, but a matter of transportation engineering and urban engineering. The global standard for barrier-free policy is clear. Major cities around the world are already implementing barrier-free policies as urban strategies. Tokyo has mandated elevator installations in all subway stations. Singapore has built an elderly-friendly city through pedestrian-centered smart city policies. Copenhagen in Denmark is promoting policies to shift about 40% of urban transportation to walking and cycling. The European Union promotes universal design policies to ensure that urban spaces are accessible to all citizens. The United States guarantees accessibility to public facilities through the Americans with Disabilities Act. These policies are not simply welfare policies, but key infrastructure strategies that enhance urban competitiveness. South Korea also has relevant legal frameworks. The Act on Promotion of the Transportation Convenience of Mobility Disadvantaged Persons stipulates that the national and local governments are responsible for guaranteeing the mobility rights of the elderly and persons with disabilities. The Act on the Guarantee of Convenience Promotion for Persons with Disabilities, the Elderly and Pregnant Women, also mandates accessibility to public facilities. However, the level of policy implementation still falls short of global standards. An engineering approach and smart city perspective are necessary for barrier-free policy. Barrier-free policy is fundamentally an issue of urban engineering design. Sidewalk width, slope gradient, pedestrian signal timing, elevator installation, and bus accessibility are all engineering design variables. Urban design standards must be adjusted to reflect the mobility characteristics of the elderly. This becomes even more effective when combined with smart city policies. A smart crosswalk system is a representative technology that supports elderly mobility. It uses sensors to recognize pedestrians and automatically extend signal times. Such technology has already been implemented in Japan and Singapore. Seoul also needs to actively introduce these systems. In addition, expanding low-floor buses and improving access to community buses are important policies. The proportion of low-floor buses in Seoul is about 60%. However, areas with high elderly populations require even higher levels of accessibility. Jongno district should be prioritized for such policies. The economic effects of barrier-free policy are significant. Barrier-free policy does not increase welfare costs, but rather enhances economic efficiency. According to World Health Organization research, when elderly social participation increases by 10%, regional consumption increases by about 3%. This directly contributes to urban economic revitalization. Jongno district is the core area of Seoul's tourism industry. The average expenditure of foreign tourists is estimated to be about $150. When the pedestrian environment improves and the average stay increases by 1 hour, tourism consumption increases by about 30%. Therefore, barrier-free policy is also a tourism industry policy. Furthermore, when the mobility rights of the elderly are guaranteed, medical and caregiving costs decrease because social participation increases. This ultimately leads to a reduction in long-term urban welfare expenditures. The future of urban policy in South Korea must shift from car-centered cities to people-centered cities. Cities exist not for automobiles but for citizens. In particular, in a super-age society, mobility rights are directly connected to human dignity. Jongno district is the heart of South Korea. It is the place where the country's history, culture, and politics originate. Therefore, the urban policy of Jongno district should become a model for urban policy across the nation. Barrier-free policy can become the starting point for Jongno district to develop into a world-class, age-friendly city. I argue that guaranteeing the mobility rights of the elderly in Jongno district is not welfare but a fundamental right. A city becomes a truly civilized city only when it guarantees the mobility of its citizens. I hope that Seoul's Jongno district will develop into the world's best pedestrian-friendly city. Thank you for watching Lee Nam-Yong's policy commentary Long.